What is it that would bring Ukraine down? Is it a military defeat? Is it economic, political fragmentation? Or do you have any views on this?
Well, I think that what will happen here is that at some point Ukraine is going to be defeated on the battlefield. Uh, and given all the problems that the Ukrainians have, and given the fact that the Europeans can only do so much to help them, and the Americans are trying to wean themselves from the Ukraine war, it's hard to see how Ukraine can hang on over the long term. So I think they lose on the battlefield. Uh, at the same time, I think their economy is in desperate straits. And if they were to lose Odessa and even more territory than they've already lost, that would just add to their woes. So I think economically, the rub state that results from this war will be a basket case. It'll be an economic basket case. And then on the political side, I would imagine that you're going to have huge political fights inside of Ukraine once the war is over with. There's going to be a big blame game. Who's going to be blamed for losing this war? And it'll be ugly. So I think economically and politically, life in this Ukrainian rump state will be ugly. And then, of course, they will have lost on the battlefield as well. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what do Ukraine-Russia relations look like moving forward? And as I said before, I thought European Russian relations would be poisonous. I think there's no question the relations between Ukraine and Russia will be poisonous. And I think relations between Ukraine and Europe will be very messy because there'll be some countries in Europe, like Hungary and Slovakia, that have a very different way of thinking about Ukraine than countries like France, Britain, and Germany. And even countries like France and Germany, or France and Britain, will be at loggerheads on some key issues regarding Ukraine. So Ukraine is facing a dismal future. And we haven't even added in the demographic issue. I mean, this is a country that's facing, a demographic death spiral. It's just horrendous what's happening. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning that says it's time for Ukraine to begin to mobilize younger people, people who are in their late teens and early 20s who've been largely exempt from the draft. That would be really good. Take all those young people and feed them into the meat grinder. I mean, this is crazy, right? It'll just exacerbate the demographic situation, which is already disastrous. So once this war is over with, Ukraine is going to be in terrible shape. There's no way that it comes out of this war winning in any way. It loses on almost every dimension. And excuse me, Glenn. And this, of course, is why people like you and I have long argued that this war should have been settled a long time ago. This is why the Ukrainians should not have walked away from the negotiating process at Istanbul in the spring of 2022. Their situation has just gotten continually worse with the passage of time. And if they manage to hang in there for another year or two, their situation is not going to improve. That's what's very important to understand here. Staying in the fight has never been a smart strategy from their point of view. They should have put an end to this a long time ago. So, when you add it all up, it's just categorically depressing. And by the way, this gets back to my earlier point, Glenn, that the question of who is to blame for this disaster is going to come racing to the fore once it's over, once the war is over with, once the fighting stops, once you get some sort of armistice. Then the question is going to become, who caused this? And of course, the vast majority of people in the West, or in the foreign policy elites in the West, are going to argue it's the Russians who caused it because they were imperialists. But you and I know better that this is largely a result of NATO expansion and that the West is principally responsible for this utter disaster.
Well, even in the unrealistic scenario that Ukraine would win, the best possible scenario, who would be left there to enjoy the victory, with this demographic, downward spiral? This is why it's very strange to me. And what makes it so much more sad as well is the fact that Zelensky, he kind of knew what would be the consequence of going down this path. You mentioned the negotiations in early 2022. Recall that back in March of 2022, he gave this interview to The Economist where he said, there are many countries in the West who don't want us to take a deal, who wants a long war. That is the word he used, long war with Russia, because we could weaken the Russians, even if it meant the destruction of Ukraine. So it's such a tragedy that we've gone down this path now for the past 4 years, and I think the war will end in Odessa, as you suggested before. If this would be the best victory for the Russians, I think, because if they can landlock Ukraine, not just would it be weakened and not be a future threat, a future frontline, but it would also lose its market value to NATO in terms of being an instrument of pushing Russia out of the Black Sea. And even the policies you see, the idea of de-Russifying Ukraine. I mean, this would entail de-Russifying Odessa, a historical Russian city, which would be just impossible for the Russians to accept and watch. So it just seems to me that this is where the war would end, by the Russians, essentially stepping into crime, and stepping into Odessa.
Yeah. Glenn, just one more point that came to mind when you were talking about Zelensky back in 2022. Before the war broke out, this is February 24th, 2022. That's when the war broke out. As you remember, in December, January, and first part of February, the Americans were saying that war is coming, war is coming. We were constantly saying that. And Zelensky was saying, stop saying that. You're going to make war happen. Zelensky was not interested in getting into a war with Russia. And then, of course, once the war breaks out, he is willing to go to Istanbul, or he's willing to send his negotiators to Istanbul. He's willing to work out a deal with the Russians. But then he makes a fatal mistake, and he sides with basically the Americans and the British, walks away from the negotiations in Istanbul and commits himself to a long war that he thinks he's going to win. He buys the Western rhetoric that Ukraine's initial successes on the battlefield, and you remember they did reasonably well on the battlefield once the war started, that those initial successes, coupled with economic sanctions and military backing from the West, would finish the Russians off. And then what happens over the course of 2022 is that, again, the Ukrainians do quite well on the battlefield. You remember they roll the Russians back in Kherson, they roll the Russians back in Kharkiv, and by the end of 2022, they think they're in great shape. And then you remember the June 2023 offensive that was supposed to, produce this giant blitzkrieg that would egregiously damage the Russian military. So once he buys on at the end of the Istanbul negotiations to the Western view of what's going to happen, once he reverses direction, he's in deep trouble because he doesn't realize it, but he's joining the losing side. You remember General Milley, again, very important. General Milley said in the fall, this is in the fall of 2022, after the Ukrainian successes in Kharkiv and Kherson, General Milley said, now's the time to cut a deal. This is the high water mark for Ukraine. And of course, Milley was correct, but nobody wanted to hear what Milley had to say. And that includes Zelensky, because Zelensky was thinking that he was on the winning side. He was on the march. Ukraine was going to win a great victory, and we would finish off the Russians, or at least wound them mortally in the summer of 2023. That was their thinking. And what happened is he just got sucked in to the vortex, and there's no getting out. And the end result is he's going to be seen by historians as having played a key role in destroying his own country.
Well, that was on that topic as well, contributing then furthermore fracturing the political West as well. So there is, I think, the outcome of this will be profound. So as you suggested, I think future historians will look back at this as being one of our greatest mistakes in terms of weakening the position of the West.
And
But
it's not only political, Glenn, it's also economic. That Europe has not only suffered politically, it's suffered economically from this war.